All right, so we're going to talk about pet ownership and the viewpoint of or argument of Peter Singer. I apologize, one second. So the roadmap up of my presentation, we'll talk about terminology, talk about Peter Singer, sentience, the importance of that when it comes to Peter Singer's argument, the PECI, which I will come about in the terminology, the utilitarian input because Peter Singer is considered utilitarian, as well as the opposing arguments of Taylor and Sagoff, adoption versus breeding, and my final argument. So some terminology, sentience, which is the feeling or sensation as distinguished from perception and thought. Speciesism, prejudice or bias in favor of members of one's own species and against another. Utilitarianism, which is their belief of an action being right if it results in the happiness of the greatest number of people in a society or a group. So happiness over harm kind of a thing. The PECI, which I mentioned just a little earlier, is the principle of equal consideration of interests, which is the interests of all sentient beings that should be given moral consideration, where like interests should be considered equally. And last but not least, inherent value, which is oppositional to instrumental value. And inherent value is a value as an end in itself. So Peter Singer, this is a very important quote. Sentience is the boundary for moral concern. It's kind of his main point in all of his arguments for this idea of pet ownership. He thinks that respecting the interests of non-human animals is more of his own beliefs, his own philosophical outlook, rather than respecting the individuals themselves. He believes it's immoral to use animals in ways that generate torture or suffering. So kind of bring back that principle we were just talking about, how respecting the interests is something you should be doing as a pet owner. To move on, sentience, we can talk more about that since it's very important. Animals are sentient beings that hold interests just as we do. So if we are doing these things in order to have shelter, food, affection, etc., then why downplay the interests of these other non-human animals? Therefore, they are deserving of moral concern because they are these sentient beings. One of the biggest thing about Peter Singer is that he strongly argues that sentient beings are the ones that deserve moral concern. And in a little bit in the opposing arguments, we're going to see how Sagoff or Taylor argues against it. So the principle of equal consideration of interests, Singer argues that we should be thinking about the interests of non-human animals in terms of an equal consideration of interests. Kind of been talking about that, how interests are very important, that we need to be considerate of these non-human animals, having that equality sort of outlook. Why would we do things to them that we wouldn't want done to ourselves? Is kind of that question that he argues that we should be asking ourselves when it comes to these non-human animals in terms of their interests. Would a utilitarian think that owning a pet is morally permissible? Sorry. For utilitarianism, the use of non-human animals can be acceptable only if the happiness their exploitation causes is greater than the harm it causes. If it is in your power to respect sentient interests without sacrificing comparable interests, then you ought to do it. So doing things that promotes happiness as opposed to harmful actions that can result in animal suffering. That is one of the reasons why they would think that it is permissible to own a pet. Let's look at Mark Sagoff and his opposing argument. A humanitarian anthropocentric ethic, an appreciation not of nature, but of the welfare of animals, will not help us to understand or justify an environmental ethic. So he believes that rights do not depend on sentience, but rather I'm so sorry. So an appreciation not of nature, but of the welfare of animals. So he's pretty much saying that sentience doesn't help us understand or justify environmental ethics. It doesn't have anything to do with sentient beings, whether that is non-human animals, plants, whatever. He just feels like that completely opposes environmental ethicism. And so looking at Paul Taylor and his opposing argument number 2, looking at his book that he wrote for Respect for Nature, he states that we are relative newcomers, that all living things have inherent value, not just sentient beings. He has a very biocentrist belief that focuses on everything in the biological environment, and that is completely against Peter Singer. Peter Singer thinks that only sentient beings have inherent value. So I thought I'd bring that up. Is breeding okay or is it not? No, it isn't. For the sole purpose of financial gain, some owners do that. Peter Singer would say that breeding is not okay because of the complications, the suffering that they go through with their health and generational issues. There's this lack of knowledge or responsibility throughout the process of breeding that comes with the owners. They don't fully understand what they're doing sometimes and can lead to these generational health issues. Not keeping the interests of the non-human animal in mind. Would I want to be put these health issues on me through breeding? Absolutely not. Adoption from shelters, on the other hand, these shelters hold thousands of animals in need of homes that have been mistreated, abused in the last one, saving them from natural disasters, having been put in places they shouldn't be, like on the sides of the road. Adopting a pet from a shelter does more good than harm. Peter Singer would argue that adopting from a shelter is morally permissible. My own personal example, I'll briefly touch upon Peanut. She was found in a grass area down in Baker City when she was a kitten, held at another shelter in Bellevue, Washington. She was kind of flip-flopping between shelters for a while until she was transferred to the Humane Society, where I adopted her at 7 months old. Piper was born on St. Patrick's Day along with her 4 other siblings. She was brought in by someone who couldn't fully take care of the kittens all by themselves, and she was adopted at 13 weeks old through the Second Chance program at the Humane Society here in Oregon. My final argument today is to the question, is owning a pet morally permissible? I argue that it is. However, owners must consider the interests of the non-human animal. I do believe that sentient beings must have their interests looked at just as we would want ours to be. Owners must not have a specious outlook when it comes to owning non-human animals. There must be that equal standpoint outlook, as opposed to the I'm superior, I'm the dominant one, I can treat and mistreat these animals as I wish. But is owning a pet morally permissible? I feel like it also depends on the responsibility that comes with that task and the owners that pick it up. And yes, so based on Peter Singer's argument and his philosophical standpoints, as well as looking at Mark Sagoff's and Paul Taylor's, I would say that it is morally permissible for my previously stated answers. So thank you so much, and yeah.